Yeah, hello, Simon.
Hi, Richard.
I am Richard Templeton. I'm a psychiatrist in Annapolis, Maryland, and I had the good fortune, the honor, and the pleasure to meet Simon Anholt when he responded and complimented my website on badmalebehavior.com. Simon has spent 20 years traveling the world and advising world leaders in over 50 countries. He has created the Good Country Project. He has a recent book called The Good Country Equation. He has indices and rating scales of leaders and countries and has a global initiative project. I'm looking forward to hearing about your project, Simon, and maybe comment on the role of personalities and the male in the creation of good and ungood countries, as you call them. And before we start, I might like to make a quote that I used to say and still do. And that is that someone said that a true measure of a civilization, or a country for that matter, is the degree to which it takes care of its people. But after learning of your work, it's clear that we need to amend that with our neighbors and the people of the planet.
Correct.
So, once again, Simon, tell us about yourself and your projects.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thanks for giving me this opportunity. I guess I've been interested in countries since I was born. I, as a very small child, always had this idea that other countries were going to be more interesting than my own country. And the people who lived in other countries were going to be nicer and more interesting than the people who lived in my country. And I assumed that this was true for everybody. And it was a long, slow and painful process before I discovered that it's not true for everybody. And in fact, there are quite a lot of people who think exactly the opposite, who assume that other countries are going to be less interesting than their own country, and that the people who live there are going to be less nice and less interesting than the people in their own country. And I suppose that realization set the stage for pretty much everything that followed. I got into work advising governments, initially at a fairly humble level, but ultimately at the level of head of state and head of government. And having now worked with nearly 60 of them, I discovered that I'd started to formulate some views about what's wrong with the world, or why the world doesn't work, which is perhaps a better way of putting it. Why we're facing a period of almost continuous and existential crisis, and why we seem to be making so little headway against some of those issues. And that's why I wrote the book that I've just written, The Good Country Equation, because, well, I wouldn't have allowed myself the luxury of writing and publishing yet another book moaning about the state of the world unless I'd felt reasonably sure that I had something slightly original to say and maybe some real concrete suggestions about how to fix it.
Well, it's a wonderful book. I just have completed it, and I was not only impressed with your descriptions and your diagnoses of countries and problems and how you wove it into your project and your life's work. I do enjoy some of the side stories that really made it very readable. It's not dry. It's not, academic. It's, some interesting stories that punctuate, the journey that you were on and where you've ended up.
I can't tell you how happy it makes me to hear you say that, Richard, because one of the first things that I found myself thinking before I wrote this book was, I can't add yet another book to the gigantic pile of books that are out there unless it's also readable. And, as I say in the introduction to the book, I feel I have to buy every book that comes out on the state of the world, and I never finish any of them because I find them so dull. They're like textbooks. They're just written in black and white, and they're full of astonishing expertise and knowledge and experience, far more than I have. But they're impossible to read, so it's pointless. And I decided, no, if I'm going to write a book on this subject, I'm going to write it in color. I'm going to make it read like an adventure story with real people and real places. And
your family's adventures, right?
Yes, exactly.
Well, tell us about your projects in general. What are the various things that you're currently working on?
Well, I think I've finally managed to get to the stage where, at least in my own mind, I've boiled down all the problems in the world to one, which is quite an achievement, and I'm very proud of it. Um, of course, if you look at all the challenges that we hear so much about today, the pandemic, obviously, but also climate change and migration and racism and intolerance and conflict of all sorts and nuclear proliferation and human slavery and human rights abuses and on and on and on and on. It's easy to become overwhelmed by that list and to think we're doomed. Um, but I think if you take a step back and you look at them very carefully, you begin to realize that they all have a few things in common. And those commonalities are quite interesting. The first thing you notice is that every single one of them is caused by the behavior of people. And no doubt we're going to have an interesting discussion shortly about which particular gender. I'm looking forward to that. And you also notice that they're now all too big for any one country to solve them. So the United States can't solve climate change, and neither can China. Mexico can't solve drug trafficking, and neither can Afghanistan, because these problems have become globalized along with everything else. And you push them down in one country and they pop up somewhere else. And so very obviously, the only way that we can ever solve any of these issues is if we collaborate as countries, institutions, corporations, and so forth. We need to work together to fix them. And that's such an obvious thing to say that sometimes I wonder if there's even any point in saying it, and yet it's the one thing that people don't seem to do. And so the single problem that I've boiled everything down to is that we need a change in the culture of governance worldwide, from one that's fundamentally competitive to one that's fundamentally collaborative. And yes, that is kind of the opposite of America First, although I don't actually have a problem with Donald Trump saying America First. It seems to me to be a statement of the obvious. If you're elected to run a country, of course you must put the interests of that country first, otherwise you don't deserve to be elected. But where I think Mr. Trump and I might disagree is in the implication, which I gather he sees, that that means everybody else has to come last. And America, of all countries, has done such a good job over the centuries of proving that you can work very hard on coming first and at the same time assist others to try to come first too. And that benefits you, and it benefits them, and it benefits everybody.
That's faced with these dual mandate thing, right?
Right. The dual mandate is the sort of summary of that.
Describe that. What does that entail?
Yeah. Well, basically what it says was that up until fairly recently in history, all people in positions of power and authority had a fairly simple single mandate. They were responsible for their own people and their own slice of the planet, and that was it. And if in order to do the right thing for their own people and their own slice of territory, they did harm to other people's people or other people's territory, that was just fine. It showed how strong they were. And my argument is that now that has to change. And all people in positions of power and authority must recognize that they're now responsible, yes, for their own people, but also for every man, woman, child, and animal on the planet, not only for their own slice of territory, but also for every square inch of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere above it, whether they like it or not. And if they don't like it, they shouldn't be in a position of power or authority.
Well, I put together some thoughts here that I'm going to introduce here. I want to get back to your various projects. So maybe, but I'll introduce this first. You know, I was thinking about change. How do you affect change in a country or in a populace? And I noted that you can change things from top down. You know, leaders in administration can engender or promote the dual mandate. You can go bottom up with the populace. Small local interest groups, people's mindsets. You can change from within, where there's people who learn of your ideas or learn of other countries, and they engender an interest in their neighbors. And you can do it from without, sometimes forcibly because there's a global threat and that we have to get together, or collaboratively, as you point out, the difference between competitive and collaboration. You can have both. I mean, it's not like one excludes the other, but if you don't collaborate, then you run the risk of, you know, not participating in what needs to happen. And you also, from without, with negotiations and contracts and trade deals and leaders meeting and recognizing the importance of collaboration.
Yeah.
So,
And don't forget the time dimension. You can do it quick and you can do it slow. Or
how do
rather,
you-
you can try to do it quickly and you can try to do it slowly. I think this is a very astute framework you've just presented, and it helps the conversation enormously, because it reminds me why I wrote the book, and it reminds me why I myself changed direction recently. Because having spent 20 years trying to do the top-down approach exclusively, top-down and right now, in other words, working with the leaders of countries and trying to persuade them directly through a kind of private diplomacy to change their ways, and having frankly failed almost completely in that effort, I began to realize
your
that you have to.
Look at the subjects you're dealing with. You're dealing with personalities and people
Yeah.
who have a mindset that is not amenable to a lot of change.
Correct. No matter how much they trust you or like you.
So you found that that wasn't as productive as what else? Or what might be more productive?
Well, I began to have this idea in my head that if I said these things to the leader, and then as he, because it so often is a he, wandered thoughtfully over to the balcony outside his stateroom and looked down and saw a crowd below all shouting the same thing that I'd just said to him in private, then he might feel as if he was in the grip of a kind of pincer action and might be more inclined to change. So that was the point at which, back in 2014, I started releasing the Good Country Index and various other projects that were designed to try to help get the support of populations. And the time one is also very important, because I was trying to do things instantly. But I began to realize, of course, the other thing that all the global challenges have in common, as I said, is that they're all caused by the behavior of people. So if you want to change the world, you have to change humanity. And the only way you can reliably hope to change humanity is over one generation, by teaching children different ways of perceiving the world and different ways of behaving. So you've got to hold your nerve for one generation and bring up a new generation of kids who run towards the global challenges instead of running away from them, which our generation has done.
And with those specific agendas right now, what can
well, the last project, which I call The Good Generation, is one that I'm spending a lot of my time preparing at the moment. It's really very simple. We start off with the observation that educating children to run towards the global challenges certainly works. The result of that is, for example, the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, who has become one of the most effective and high-profile voices in favor of mitigating climate change. She is a product of the Swedish school system, which for several years has been teaching children about climate change. The consequence is, as soon as she leaves school, she runs towards the problem of climate change and considers that she should devote her not inconsiderable energies towards trying to fix that. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of experiments of that sort going on all over the world. The problem is that they're piecemeal. They focus on individual topics like climate change, which on its own is meaningless. You've got to consider it alongside other problems like migration and inequality and so forth. And they tend to be no bigger than a country. Most of the time, they're no bigger than a school district. And as a consequence, because these initiatives are so fragmented all over the world, they amount to nothing, or sometimes less than nothing, because they're pushing kids even further apart through the cultural differences in the way they're teaching these topics. So the project is really very simple. It says, let's have a big online global conversation where we get parents and teachers and children and experts from every single country on earth to use the miracle of online conversation moderated by artificial intelligence, which can make these big conversations much easier and much more meaningful, about what we all believe are the fundamental values or virtues or skill sets that we would like all of our children to be brought up with in the next generation. From the output of that conversation, a group of legal and constitutional experts will write a compact, a global compact, and then I will donate it to UNESCO. We will invite the education ministers of every country on earth to sail into St. Mark's Square in Venice in their gondolas and sign it. And then we'll figure out how to implement it. That's another project which I'm not worrying about right now. We'll never get started because the complexity is so appalling. But to the people who say, oh, you'll never get global agreement on something as sensitive as the education of children, which people often do say. I would say go back, if you will, and have another look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the UN Charter. Those are two of the most extraordinary achievements of humanity. And they demonstrate that in times of great stress, those two were produced shortly after the Second World War. We're in a time of almost equivalent stress at the moment, thanks to the pandemic and to climate change. We really can agree as a species when we need to. And I think it's time to do it again, but this time on how we're going to raise the next generation.
Well, in light of that, I came up with an idea that's sort of similar, and it's very simple. I was thinking good country, global citizen.
Mm-hmm.
Just those two words, that creating good countries, the country you're proud of, country you can say takes care of the world, interested in your home base, but also interested in the world, and to be a good citizen of your own country, but also a good citizen, a global citizen, aware of the world situation. Because we do obviously live in a very international, interconnected, interdependent, and so many people are traveling all over the world. So the more we're aware of the other cultures, the more we can be stewards of the world's people.
And the more it enriches our own lives and our own experience. I mean, when I'm saying this kind of stuff to individuals or when I'm saying it to governments, it's very important, I find, to stress that I'm not asking countries or people to, quote unquote, do the right thing because it's morally correct, because I know that doesn't go very far, especially with countries which are not on the whole moral entities. It's in their interest to do this. And what I call the good country equation, in part, makes this argument. There's 20 years of my own research that proves that countries that behave themselves, that behave as responsible sovereign entities within the international community, end up with better images. People admire them, they like them. And the countries that end up with better images are the countries that get more tourism, more trade, more foreign investment. In other words, they do better. So it's just exactly like corporate social responsibility in the commercial sphere, but now elevated to the level of the nation state. So this is enlightened self-interest. This isn't a plea for people to be somehow more moral. Apart from anything else, it's more fun. The more you mix up cultures, the more you meet with other people, the more you look outside your own experience and collaborate with others, the better the results become. It's just more fruitful, it's more productive. And again, that's easy to prove.
Yep, absolutely. Now, personalities. Now, you can see personality as an individual construct. You're dealing with a leader that you're trying to influence to alter his way of thinking and then ultimately alter his administrative goals.
Yeah.
But you also could take the whole country and say the country has a certain personality. It could be insular and kind of guarded, or it could be very cosmopolitan, as you use that word, and interested in the world affairs and takes an active participation in it. So there are good personalities, there are all kinds of personalities. But what has your experience been with working with the individual personality, the leaders perhaps, and then maybe there are groups you could characterize as having a certain, construct and approach to things that either fosters your work or, impedes it?
When I'm working with the leaders of countries, never far from me are the big five personality traits and Hofstadter's 5 dimensions of culture. And to overlay the personality characteristics onto the anthropological characteristics of the country that this individual represents it always produces a mass of data and a mass of observations, which sometimes just serves to make things more complicated, but a lot of the time it's very, very illuminating indeed. And it is striking.
How often does the leader's perspective, or his personality, his goals, his values, match with the populace? Now that's very fluid, and there are lots of historical situations that support all kinds of things. But what do you think about all that?
Less often than the leader imagines. It is a trait I've often noticed with people who've managed to climb up the slippery pole and become head of state or head of government, that they believe really quite profoundly that almost whatever they believe or trust in or value, they're going to be automatically mirroring the will of the people. And of course, there is no such thing as the will of the people. They all think different things. And sure, you can do research and you can find out what the majority thinks, but that's a very, very poor analog for what's really going on. And one of the things I find most striking is how absolutely convinced the majority of leaders are that they will not remain in power if they focus too much on externalities. There's an old saying in government that no election was ever won on foreign policy. And this belief goes very, very deep indeed. And the interesting thing is that if you research it, you find that very often they're actually quite wrong about that. It's interesting because almost all of the leaders I've ever worked with are not mad or bad or dangerous people. They're very often there primarily because they have a strong public service ethic and they want to do something for their country. And very often they're also quite internationally minded as well. It's fairly common for them to say, you know, I'd really like to do something about climate change, or I'd really like to do something about migration, but I just don't believe that the voters would allow me to take my eye off the ball to that extent. And so that gives me permission to come in and point out to them, A, that it doesn't involve taking your eye off the ball at all. Those two issues, domestic and international, are seamlessly interconnected in the 21st century. And the idea that they're two different topics and one should be addressed and the other laid aside is entirely wrong and entirely misleading. But also B, if they were to do some research, they might be surprised just how many of their population would actually rather have a leader who was internationally recognized and celebrated for being a Nelson Mandela, somebody who provides some international leadership when he's in international forums, rather than simply going to the G20 to fight for the best deal for his own people. We're all a bit sick of that.
Well, the other thing is that leaders are transitory. Some are in power long periods of time.
Yes.
And on an election ballot, 5% difference in a ballot can determine the whole course of a country's trajectory. And you're dealing with that fluid, transient, potentially transient leadership or administration that can flip completely, as we might see in our own election coming up.
Which is why monarchies are easier to work with.
That once you convince the monarch to do good, then you've got a guy that's on your side. Right?
Well, that's right. It's of course a lottery whether the person is the right person or not, although on the whole royal families do go to an awful lot of trouble to try to bring up their sons and daughters with the right moral sense and the right care for the country. So on balance, the majority probably are, even if they don't have the abilities, they certainly have the right attitude to run a country. But sure, it's not very fair for power to be inherited, and it's not very safe for power to be inherited. But it would be nice if one could find a way of bottling that completely, in the true sense of the word, disinterested desire for the good of the nation that monarchs can sometimes show. They're not up for election. They're not in a hurry. They don't care about party politics. They just want to do the right thing for the nation over the long period. And that's a very, very useful attitude, which is very seldom to be found amongst elected leaders.
Well, I've conceptualized that the largest problem since the beginning of time has been destructive self-interest rather than constructive public interest.
Yes.
Or constructive self-interest.
Yes.
And so anything that's destructive to the nature, to relationships, undermines this collaboration and care about the other man, the other person. So.
Very true. But we have to, we also can't discuss these things without also talking about tribalism, because that plays into this conversation endlessly at the moment. And one of the things that I say in the book, and I find myself saying a lot these days, is warning people to beware of the idea that there's a species of human called a localist and a species of human called a globalist, and that they're deadly enemies, and that they should spend their days screaming hatred at each other on social media. This is a very dangerous idea, and it makes fools of all of us because it's simply not true. We're all a bit localist and we're all a bit globalist, just as we're almost all of us a little bit conservative and a little bit liberal or progressive or whatever the opposite is, left or right. These distinctions all end up being framed as tribalisms, but they're not really at all. They're just corners of our own mind.
Well, a
And
saying that you've probably heard, and I think is more current, is think globally, act locally.
yes,
And that's the mindset that you're trying to engender, that, we don't have to, not, we can do good and work locally on both external good and common good.
yes. But we have no choice, because who of us is able to actually act globally? Almost none of us. But we all have the ability to act locally. And if we do that in the context of a global awareness, then we're doing the right thing. I'm convinced of it. But I'm always very anxious to try to help people to understand that when I talk about these ideas, and when I launch these projects, and when I write this book, this is not in any sense a backlash against the so-called rising tide of nationalism, or an attack on conservative values or localist values, nothing of the kind. What I'm trying to do is to bring those two very human perceptions together and help them to understand that they're not antithetical to each other at all, they're complementary.
Yeah, and there's no political agenda, there's no power, agenda. It's really raising our consciousness to what's good for ourselves locally and globally. In
Yes,
fact, that value set transcends the turning over of a kingdom or a new president. It doesn't go away. It can sustain the change because it's
yes,
something that people can hold dear and just ensure that continues to happen.
yes. And that's why over the years, as an advisor to governments, I've taken care to ensure that whatever systems or structures we build as a result of my advice are properly institutionalized, and they're public-private, and they're spread well beyond government. And that's partly because the issues I'm talking about with governments, their role in the international community, are in any case far too important to be left to a few transient people running the government at any given moment in time. But it's also because you need to bridge the different time horizons of government, of the private sector, of civil society. And by involving as many different actors as possible in these initiatives, you greatly increase the chance of it not being all pulped the moment the government changes.
Well, this is absolutely enriching and enjoyable. And
Isn't it?
any thoughts at the end of this to pass along to, Americans maybe, and the rest of the world? But
Well, let me say two things. First of all, I have to say that rather unfashionably, I'm super optimistic at the moment. Okay, optimism is for me an incurable disease. I don't seem to have been able to fix it. But I just think this is a wonderful moment, a marvelous time to be discussing these things. Because on every side of every spectrum, real or imaginary spectrum, nobody is feeling quite so sure as they were a few years ago. And that's a wonderful moment to be introducing new ideas and questioning old attitudes, because people are actually listening for the first time in a great many years. There's a great deal less complacency at either end of any of the spectra, real or imaginary, than there has been. So a good time to be talking about these things. Humanity has a long and distinguished tradition of realizing that it's going the wrong way at about 11:59 p.m., just before midnight strikes and it's far too late. Of course, I do worry about climate change because atmospheric CO2 has a tremendous lag of about 10 years in it between the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and the change in the temperature. So there is a risk that 11:59 is about an hour too late already. So we mustn't become complacent about that. But broadly speaking, I'm feeling very positive, and I'm feeling particularly positive about the young generation who, with or without the Good Generation Project, are so much better than we were. And they don't understand a lot of the silly things that we get so het up about. I talk to my children about racism. It's impossible to even have the conversation with them because they just don't know what that means or why anybody would have feelings like that. Maybe it was because I taught them cultural anthropology when they were 7, or maybe it's just because they are of that generation. That was the penultimate thing I wanted to say. And the last thing I wanted to say was that I hope that people will read the book and enjoy the book. And I'm already planning the next one. I realized as soon as I'd finished writing it that, of course, this is 1/3 of a trilogy. If the fundamental driving purpose behind of it is, as I said, to change the fundamental culture of governance worldwide from competitive to collaborative, then we've got to ask ourselves who is primarily able to make that change, who is primarily responsible for directing the views and the behaviors of humanity. Well, the first category is nations and governments, which is my field. It's where I spent the last 20 years. That's why the first book is about nations and governments. The second one has to be about corporations, because they influence the behaviors of just as many people as governments do, and in some ways more directly. And then the third one is religions and philosophies, but I'm going to wait till I'm 70 before I write that one.
Well, that fits in with Maslow or Jung's ideas of life. As you get older, you get into the spiritual realm. But
Indeed.
let's hope we all think more globally and collaboratively. And it's a good time. And again, appreciate the time spent with you and learning more about your current projects and your future endeavors.
Thank you, Richard. We'll speak again soon, I hope.
The best. Thank you.